The rain hammered against the hospital windows as Admiral Harrison Matthews walked down the sterile corridor. His polished boots echoed with each measured step, the sound cutting through the antiseptic silence that seemed to follow him everywhere these days. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his weathered face, making the lines around his eyes appear deeper than his 62 years warranted. He had received the call 3 hours ago while reviewing deployment schedules in his office at the naval base. The voice on the other end had been clinical, professional, but the words had hit him like a torpedo to the gut. Lieutenant Sarah Chun, one of his most promising officers, had been found unconscious in her apartment by her roommate. The initial report mentioned possible assault, but details remained scarce. Sarah had been under his command for 2 years now, ever since she graduated from the Naval Academy with honors. She was brilliant, dedicated, and possessed the kind of tactical mind that reminded him of his younger self. More than that, she had become like a daughter to him after his own family had distanced themselves following his divorce. The Navy had been his life for 4 decades, and officers like Sarah represented hope for the future of the service he loved. As he approached room 314, Admiral Matthews straightened his uniform jacket and prepared himself for what he might find. The door was slightly ajar, and he could hear the soft beeping of medical equipment from within. He knocked gently and waited for permission to enter. "Come in," came a weak voice from inside. Sarah was propped up in the hospital bed, her usually perfect posture replaced by a careful stillness that spoke of hidden pain. Her black hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, so different from the regulation bun she always wore on duty. Despite the pallor of her skin and the exhaustion evident in her dark eyes, she managed a small smile when she saw him. "Admiral, you didn't need to come," she said, attempting to sit up straighter but wincing at the movement. "Nonsense," he replied, pulling a chair closer to her bedside. "How are you feeling, Lieutenant?" Sarah's smile faltered slightly. "I've been better, sir. The doctors say I have a concussion, some bruised ribs, and—" She paused, looking away toward the window where rain continued to streak down the glass. "They want to keep me for observation for another day or 2. Admiral Matthews studied her carefully. In all the time he had known Sarah, she had never been one to show weakness or vulnerability. She approached every challenge with determination and confidence, whether it was a difficult training exercise or a complex strategic problem. Seeing her like this, diminished and hurting, stirred something protective in him that went beyond his professional responsibilities. "The police want to speak with you when you're feeling up to it," he said carefully. "But there's no rush? Your health comes first." Sarah nodded slowly, her fingers unconsciously pulling at the hospital gown's neckline. "I understand, sir. I need some time to process everything." The Admiral leaned forward in his chair. "Sarah, I want you to know that whatever happened, whatever you need, the Navy will support you. I will support you. You're not alone in this." For a moment, her composure cracked, and he saw tears gathering in her eyes before she quickly blinked them away. "Thank you, sir. That means more to me than you know." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, listening to the rain and the distant sounds of the hospital. Admiral Matthews found himself thinking about his own daughter, whom he had barely spoken to in 3 years. The demands of military life had created a chasm between them that seemed impossible to bridge. But perhaps it wasn't too late to be the kind of father figure that Sarah needed right now. "Sir," Sarah said quietly, breaking into his thoughts, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "In your experience, how do you maintain your strength when everything feels like it's falling apart?" The question caught him off guard. Throughout his career, Admiral Matthews had been known for his unwavering composure under pressure. He had commanded ships through dangerous waters, made life-and-death decisions that affected hundreds of sailors, and maintained discipline even in the most challenging circumstances. But looking at this young woman who had clearly been through something traumatic, he realized that strength wasn't always about maintaining a rigid exterior. "Strength isn't about never falling down, Lieutenant," he said finally. "It's about getting back up, even when every instinct tells you to stay down. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help." Sarah considered his words, her gaze fixed on her hands folded in her lap. "The thing is, sir, I've always prided myself on being independent, on handling whatever came my way. But this is different. Different how?" She looked up at him, and for the first time since he had entered the room, he saw a flash of the steel that had made her such an exceptional officer. "Because this time I didn't see it coming. I trusted the wrong person, and it nearly cost me everything." Admiral Matthews felt a chill run down his spine. The implication in her words suggested that her injuries weren't the result of a random attack, but something far more personal and devastating. He wanted to press for details, to understand what had happened to her, but he could see that she was already at her emotional limit. "Trust is a precious commodity," he said instead. "When someone betrays it, the damage goes far deeper than any physical wound. But that doesn't mean you should stop trusting altogether. It means you learn to trust more wisely." Sarah nodded slowly, though he could see she wasn't entirely convinced. The trauma was still too fresh, the wounds too raw for wisdom to provide much comfort. What she needed now was time to heal, both physically and emotionally. And the knowledge that she had people who would stand by her regardless of what had happened as visiting hours drew to a close, Admiral Matthews prepared to leave. He stood and adjusted his uniform, then looked down at the young officer who had come to mean so much to him. "I'll be back tomorrow," he promised. "And Sarah? Whatever you decide to tell the police, whatever you need to do to heal from this, you have my complete support." "That's not just your commanding officer talking, that's a promise from someone who cares about your future." After he left, Sarah lay in the growing darkness of her hospital room, thinking about trust, strength, and the long road to recovery that stretched ahead of her. 3 days later, Admiral Matthews returned to the hospital to find Sarah sitting in the chair by the window, dressed in civilian clothes and staring out at the gray morning sky. Her discharge papers lay on the bedside table, but she made no move to leave. The bruising on her face had darkened to deep purples and yellows, making her look younger and more fragile than her 26 years. "Ready to get out of here?" he asked, settling into the visitor's chair. Sarah turned to look at him, and he was struck by how different her eyes appeared. Where once there had been confidence and determination, now there was a wariness that reminded him of wounded animals he had encountered during survival training exercises. She was constantly scanning, constantly alert, as if danger might emerge from any shadow. "I suppose I have to be," she replied. "The doctors say I'm healed enough to go home, but honestly, sir, I'm not sure I know what home means anymore." Admiral Matthews had spoken with the police the previous evening. Detective Rodriguez had filled him in on the basic facts of the case, though many details remained unclear. Sarah had been attacked by someone she knew, someone she had trusted enough to let into her apartment. The assault had been brutal and deliberate, leaving her with injuries that suggested a level of personal hatred that disturbed even the seasoned detective. "Have you thought about where you'd like to stay while you recover?" he asked carefully. "The Navy has arrangements for temporary housing if your apartment doesn't feel safe." Sarah's laugh was bitter and hollow. "Safe, that's an interesting concept. I used to think I understood what it meant to be safe. I carried weapons, I knew self-defense, I was trained to handle dangerous situations. But none of that mattered when the danger came from someone I cared about." The admission hung in the air between them like smoke from a distant fire. Admiral Matthews had suspected that the attack was personal, but hearing it confirmed in Sarah's own words made his chest tight with anger. In his 4 decades of military service, he had seen many forms of betrayal. But there was something particularly cruel about violating someone's trust in such an intimate and devastating way. "Who was it, Sarah?" he asked gently. "You don't have to tell me everything, but if there's anything I can do to help... For a long moment she remained silent, her fingers unconsciously tracing the edge of her discharge papers. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet he had to lean forward to hear her. "His name is Commander Marcus Webb. He's stationed at Norfolk, assigned to Naval Intelligence. We had been dating for about 6 months." She paused, swallowing hard. "I thought I loved him." "I thought he loved me." Admiral Matthews felt his blood run cold. He knew Marcus Webb by reputation, a rising star in naval intelligence, well-connected and ambitious. Webb came from a military family with significant political influence, the kind of officer who seemed destined for flag rank. The implications of what Sarah was telling him were staggering, both for her personally and for the potential scandal it could create within the naval hierarchy. "What happened?" he asked, though he dreaded hearing the answer. Sarah closed her eyes, as if trying to block out the memories. He had been acting strange for a few weeks, possessive and jealous. He didn't like me working late or spending time with other officers, even in professional settings. I should have seen the warning signs, but I kept making excuses for his behavior. She opened her eyes and looked directly at Admiral Matthews. "Last Friday night he came to my apartment unexpectedly. He had been drinking, and he was angry about something. He accused me of having an affair with Captain Morrison from my department, which was completely untrue. When I tried to explain that my relationship with Captain Morrison was purely professional, he became enraged." Admiral Matthews clenched his fists in his lap, fighting to maintain his composure as Sarah continued her account. The clinical way she described the escalating violence made it clear that she was struggling to process the emotional impact of what had happened to her. He grabbed me by the shoulders and shook me, screaming about how I was betraying him and making him look like a fool. When I tried to push him away, he hit me hard. I fell backward and struck my head on the coffee table. Sarah's voice began to tremble slightly. That's when I knew this wasn't just an argument that had gotten out of hand. The look in his eyes. It was like he wanted to hurt me, like he enjoyed seeing me afraid. The Admiral found himself thinking about his own daughter again, imagining her in a similar situation, and the rage that built in his chest was almost overwhelming. But he knew that Sarah needed his support, not his anger, so he forced himself to remain calm and focused. "Did you report this to the police right away?" he asked. Sarah shook her head. "I was unconscious for several hours. My roommate found me the next morning and called 911. By the time I woke up in the hospital, Marcus had already called my phone multiple times, leaving messages saying he was sorry and that it had all been a misunderstanding. He said he would ruin my career if I told anyone what really happened." The calculated nature of Webb's response told Admiral Matthews everything he needed to know about the man's character. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of poor judgment. It was the behavior of someone who was used to using his position and influence to escape consequences for his actions. "Sarah, I want you to listen to me very carefully," he said, leaning forward in his chair. "What happened to you was not your fault. Webb's threats about your career are empty. He has no power over your future in the Navy unless you let him have it. And if he thinks his family connections will protect him from the consequences of assault, he's about to learn otherwise." For the first time since he had arrived, Sarah's posture straightened slightly, and he caught a glimpse of the strong officer he had come to respect. "What are you saying, sir?" "I'm saying that you have options and you have support. The Navy takes assault cases very seriously, especially when they involve officers abusing their position. There are proper channels for handling the situation, and I will personally ensure that your case receives the attention it deserves." Sarah considered his words carefully. "But sir, he's a commander, and he comes from a well-connected family. His father is a retired admiral, and his uncle is in Congress. People like that protect each other, don't they?" Admiral Matthews stood and moved to the window, looking out at the naval base visible in the distance. "Sarah, I've spent 40 years in this Navy, and I've seen good men and women destroyed by people who thought their rank or connections made them untouchable. But I've also seen justice prevail when good people stand up and demand it." He turned back to face her. "The question is, are you willing to fight for justice? Not just for yourself, but for every other person Webb might hurt in the future?" Sarah was quiet for several minutes, clearly weighing the implications of moving forward with formal charges against someone so well connected. Admiral Matthews could see the internal struggle playing out across her features, the desire for justice warring with fear of retaliation and the practical concerns about her naval career. Finally, she nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. I want to fight. I want to make sure he can't do this to anyone else." Admiral Matthews felt a surge of pride and admiration for the young woman before him. Despite everything she had endured, she was choosing courage over convenience, justice over self-preservation. It was exactly the kind of moral strength that the Navy needed in its officers. The following Monday morning found Admiral Matthews in his office earlier than usual, surrounded by case files, naval regulations, and legal precedents. He had spent the weekend researching the proper procedures for handling assault cases within the military justice system, and what he had learned both encouraged and worried him. While the Uniform Code of Military Justice provided clear guidelines for prosecuting such crimes, the reality of military politics meant that cases involving well-connected officers often faced additional scrutiny and obstacles. A knock on his door interrupted his research. "Enter," he called, looking up to see Captain Jennifer Morrison, Sarah's immediate supervisor, standing in the doorway. Captain Morrison was a 15-year veteran with an impeccable record and a reputation for fairness that had earned her respect throughout the fleet. "Admiral, do you have a few minutes to discuss Lieutenant Chun's situation?" she asked, closing the door behind her as she entered. "Of course, Captain. Please have a seat." Captain Morrison settled into one of the chairs facing his desk, her expression serious. "Sir, I've been reviewing Sarah's recent performance evaluations and duty assignments, trying to understand if there were any warning signs we might have missed regarding her relationship with Commander Webb." Admiral Matthews leaned back in his chair. "What did you find?" "Nothing that would have raised red flags at the time, but looking back with current knowledge, there are some patterns that concern me." She opened the folder and pulled out several documents. Starting about 3 months ago, Sarah began declining social invitations from fellow officers. She also requested to be removed from several joint training exercises that would have required her to work closely with male colleagues from other commands. The Admiral frowned. "Did you ask her about these changes at the time?" "I did, and she explained them as wanting to focus more on her professional development and avoid any appearance of impropriety. Given her dedication to her career, it seemed reasonable." Captain Morrison paused, her expression troubled. "But now I'm wondering if Webb was isolating her, making her feel like normal professional interactions were somehow inappropriate." Admiral Matthews had seen similar patterns before, though not in military contexts. Abusive partners often work systematically to separate their victims from support networks, making them more dependent and vulnerable. The fact that Webb had apparently used military protocol and Sarah's own professional aspirations against her made his behavior even more insidious. "There's something else, sir," Captain Morrison continued. "I did some informal checking on Commander Webb's previous assignments. He's worked in 3 different locations over the past 5 years, and at each duty station, he was involved in what were described as workplace conflicts with female officers. The details were never made public, but the pattern is concerning." Admiral Matthews felt his jaw tighten. If Webb had a history of problematic behavior toward female colleagues, it suggested that his assault on Sarah was not an isolated incident of poor judgment, but part of a larger pattern of abuse and misconduct. "Captain, I want you to compile everything you can find about Webb's service record and any complaints or conflicts involving female officers. Be discreet but thorough. If we're going to pursue this case, we need to understand the full scope of his behavior." "Yes, sir. I'll get started on that immediately." After Captain Morrison left, Admiral Matthews placed a call to the base's legal officer. "Commander Patricia Walsh." Walsh was a former prosecutor with extensive experience in military justice cases, and her reputation for thorough preparation and aggressive pursuit of misconduct cases made her exactly the kind of advocate Sarah would need. "Commander Walsh, I need to discuss a sensitive case with you. Can you come to my office?" "Of course, Admiral. I'll be there in 15 minutes. While he waited, Admiral Matthews thought about the conversation he'd had with Sarah the previous evening. She had returned to her apartment with a friend staying with her for support, but she was clearly struggling with anxiety and hypervigilance. Every unexpected sound made her jump, and she admitted that she was having difficulty sleeping. The psychological trauma from the assault was proving to be as challenging as her physical injuries. Commander Walsh arrived precisely on time, carrying a legal pad and wearing the focused expression that made her such an effective prosecutor. She was in her early 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun and intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "Admiral, how can I help you?" "I need your expertise on a case involving the assault of one of my officers by another naval officer. The victim is Lieutenant Sarah Chun, and the alleged perpetrator is Commander Marcus Webb from Norfolk." Commander Walsh's eyebrows rose slightly. "Webb from the Intelligence Division? Son of Admiral retired William Webb?" "The same. I take it you're familiar with his family connections?" "Unfortunately, yes. His father still has significant influence within naval circles, and the family has a reputation for protecting their own." She leaned forward in her chair. "But sir, if Lieutenant Chun was assaulted, those connections shouldn't matter. We have a duty to pursue justice regardless of the perpetrator's background." Admiral Matthews outlined the basic facts of the case, including Sarah's account of the attack and the evidence collected by civilian police. Commander Walsh took detailed notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions about timelines and witness statements. "Sir, based on what you've told me, we have a strong case for court-martial proceedings under Article 128 of the UCMJ for assault and Article 134 for conduct unbecoming an officer," Walsh said when he finished. "However, I need to warn you that pursuing charges against someone from Webb's family will likely result in significant political pressure to make this case disappear." "What kind of pressure are we talking about?" "Phone calls from Washington, questions about the strength of the evidence, suggestions that Lieutenant Chun might be better served by a quiet transfer to another command. The Webb family has friends in high places who won't hesitate to use their influence to protect Marcus." Admiral Matthews considered this information carefully. He had always prided himself on his political acumen and his ability to navigate the complex relationships that govern naval leadership. But this case was different. This wasn't about competing interests or strategic disagreements. This was about protecting one of his officers and ensuring that justice was served. "Commander, I need you to prepare the strongest possible case against Webb, document everything. Anticipate every defense strategy and be ready for whatever political interference we might face. Lieutenant Chen deserves nothing less than our best effort." "Understood, sir." "I'll need to interview Lieutenant Chun personally to get her complete statement. Given the nature of the assault, I'd recommend having a victim advocate present during our meeting." Arrange it." "And Commander? I want regular updates on your progress. If anyone tries to interfere with this investigation, I want to know about it immediately." After Walsh left, Admiral Matthews sat alone in his office, contemplating the battle ahead. He knew that pursuing charges against Webb would likely make him enemies among powerful people within the naval hierarchy. But he also knew that leadership meant making difficult decisions based on principle rather than convenience. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed it was Admiral Robert Sterling, his immediate superior and longtime friend. "Harrison, I heard there might be some kind of incident involving one of your officers and Marcus Webb," Sterling said without preamble. "I'm hoping we can handle this quietly and professionally." The speed with which news of the case had reached, Sterling told Admiral Matthews everything he needed to know about the Webb family's influence network. Clearly, they were already mobilizing their resources to contain the damage. "Bob, if you're calling to ask me to drop this case, you're wasting your time," Admiral Matthews replied firmly. "One of my officers was brutally assaulted, and I intend to ensure that her attacker faces appropriate consequences. Harrison, I understand your loyalty to your people, but you need to consider the bigger picture here. The Webb family has been serving this country for 3 generations. Marcus made a mistake, but destroying his career over what amounts to a domestic dispute seems excessive." Admiral Matthews felt anger rising in his chest. The casual dismissal of Sarah's assault as a domestic dispute revealed exactly the kind of attitude that allowed predators like Webb to continue their behavior unchecked. Bob. With all due respect, this wasn't a domestic dispute. This was a criminal assault committed by a naval officer against another naval officer. If we don't hold our people accountable for their actions, what kind of message does that send to the rest of the fleet? The phone conversation with Admiral Sterling left Matthews feeling more determined than ever, but also aware of the challenges that lay ahead. He spent the remainder of the morning making discreet inquiries among his own network of contacts, trying to understand the full extent of the web, family's influence, and identify potential allies in the fight for justice. By afternoon, he had received calls from 3 other flag officers, each suggesting that pursuing charges against Webb might not be in the Navy's best interests. The coordination of these calls made it clear that the Webb family's damage control efforts were already well underway, and the pressure on him to drop the case would only intensify. At 1500 hours, Admiral Matthews drove to Sarah's apartment to check on her condition and discuss the legal proceedings. He found her sitting at her kitchen table with her laptop open, surrounded by case law printouts and legal documents. Despite the visible bruising on her face and the careful way she moved to avoid aggravating her injured ribs, her eyes held a determination he hadn't seen since before the attack. "Lieutenant, what's all this?" he asked, gesturing toward the papers scattered across the table. "I've been researching similar cases within the military justice system, sir. I want to understand what we're up against and how other victims have handled situations like this." She looked up at him with a mixture of resolve and vulnerability. "I also want to understand what this process is going to cost me personally and professionally." Admiral Matthews took a seat across from her, noting the dark circles under her eyes that suggested she hadn't been sleeping well. "What have you learned?" "That the odds aren't in my favor," she replied honestly. "I found records of 6 similar cases over the past 10 years involving assault charges against well-connected officers. 3 cases were dismissed before reaching court-martial. 2 resulted in administrative punishment rather than criminal prosecution, and only 1 ended in a conviction." The statistics were sobering but not entirely surprising. Admiral Matthews had suspected that cases involving powerful families faced additional obstacles, but seeing the pattern documented so starkly was discouraging. "Sarah, I need you to understand that pursuing this case is going to be difficult, and the Webb family will likely use every resource at their disposal to discredit your testimony and your character. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, her fingers unconsciously moving to her ribs where the worst of her injuries remained hidden beneath her shirt. "Sir, can I show you something?" Without waiting for an answer, she stood and moved to face away from him. With deliberate, careful movements, she pulled the back of her shirt up, revealing a pattern of bruises that took Admiral Matthews' breath away. The marks clearly showed where Webb had grabbed her, hit her, and thrown her against furniture. But more shocking were the thin, precise scars that crisscrossed her lower back, old injuries that had nothing to do with the recent assault. Admiral Matthews found himself speechless, staring at evidence of violence that went far beyond what Sarah had initially described. The fresh bruises were painful to see, but the older scars told a story of sustained abuse that made him sick to his stomach. "Those scars are from my childhood," Sarah said quietly, lowering her shirt and turning back to face him. "My stepfather used to beat me with a belt when my mother wasn't home. I survived that, and I survived what Marcus did to me. I won't let either of them define who I am or what I'm capable of achieving." The revelation recontextualized everything Admiral Matthews thought he knew about Sarah's strength and resilience. She hadn't just overcome the recent assault, she had survived a childhood of abuse and used that experience to forge herself into the exceptional officer he had come to admire. "Sarah, I'm sorry you went through that. And I'm sorry that what happened with Webb brought those memories back." "It did bring them back," she admitted, sitting down again. "But it also reminded me of something important. Bullies and abusers count on their victims staying silent. They count on people being too afraid or too ashamed to speak up. My stepfather got away with hurting me because I was a child and didn't know I had options. But I'm not a child anymore, and I do have options." Admiral Matthews felt a surge of admiration for the young woman before him. Her courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was the decision to act despite being afraid, to fight for justice even when the odds seemed insurmountable. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "I need you to promise me that if this gets too difficult, if the pressure becomes too much for you to handle, you'll tell me honestly. I won't blame you for protecting your own career, sir. You've already done more for me than I had any right to expect." The offer surprised him. Throughout his career, Admiral Matthews had prided himself on never abandoning his people, but he appreciated Sarah's understanding of the political realities they faced. Her willingness to release him from any obligation made his commitment to her case even stronger. "Lieutenant, I've been in the Navy for 40 years, and I've never walked away from a fight when I knew I was on the right side. I'm not starting now." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Sarah tensed visibly, her hand moving instinctively to the small of her back where Admiral Matthews now knew she kept a concealed weapon. The hypervigilance that had developed since the assault was clearly still affecting her daily life. "I'll get it," Admiral Matthews said, standing and moving toward the door. Through the peephole, he could see Commander Walsh standing in the hallway with a woman he didn't recognize. "It's Commander Walsh," he told Sarah, who relaxed slightly as he opened the door. "Admiral, this is Lieutenant Commander Maria Santos, our victim advocate specialist. She be working with Lieutenant Chen throughout the legal process." Commander Santos was a small woman with kind eyes and a gentle manner that immediately put Sarah at ease. As a former victim of military sexual assault herself, Santos had dedicated her career to helping other service members navigate the complex process of seeking justice within the military system. "Lieutenant Chen, I want you to know that my role is to support you throughout this process, regardless of what decisions you make about pursuing charges. I'm here to answer questions, provide resources, and ensure that your rights are protected every step of the way." Over the next 2 hours, Commander Walsh conducted a detailed interview with Sarah about the assault, while Commander Santos provided emotional support and ensured that the questions were asked in a sensitive manner. Admiral Matthews observed the process, taking notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions when appropriate. As the interview progressed, a clearer picture emerged of Webb's escalating pattern of controlling and abusive behavior. What had initially appeared to be isolated acts of jealousy and violence revealed themselves to be part of a systematic campaign of psychological manipulation that had been building for months. "Lieutenant Chun, based on your testimony and the evidence collected by civilian police, I believe we have sufficient grounds to pursue charges under the Uniform Code of Military Justice," Commander Walsh said as the interview concluded. "However, I want to be completely honest with you about what to expect moving forward." She outlined the formal process for filing charges, the likelihood of pretrial negotiations, and the potential for the case to become highly publicized given Webb's family connections. She also discussed the possibility that Webb's defense team would attempt to portray the assault as consensual rough behavior that had gotten out of hand. The defense will likely argue that your relationship with Commander Webb was consensual and that the injuries you sustained were the result of an argument that escalated beyond either party's intentions, Walsh explained. They may also attempt to introduce evidence about your past relationships or personal history to suggest that you have a pattern of making false accusations. Sarah's jaw tightened at this last point. "They can try whatever tactics they want, Commander. The evidence speaks for itself, and I'm not afraid of having my character examined. I've lived my entire adult life with integrity, and I'm confident that any fair investigation will reflect that." Admiral Matthews felt proud of Sarah's composure and determination, but he also recognized the emotional toll that defending herself against character assassination would exact. The coming months would test not only her resolve to seek justice, but also her ability to maintain her mental health and professional effectiveness while under intense scrutiny. As the meeting concluded, Commander Santos provided Sarah with contact information for counseling services and support groups for military assault survivors. She also gave her a detailed pamphlet explaining her rights throughout the legal process and the resources available to help her cope with both the practical and emotional challenges ahead. After Walsh and Santos left, Admiral Matthews remained with Sarah to discuss the next steps. The formal charges would be filed within the week, initiating a process that could take months or even years to resolve completely. 3 weeks after the formal charges were filed against Commander Webb, Admiral Matthews found himself facing the most intense political pressure of his entire career. The phone calls from senior leadership had become daily occurrences, and the suggestions that he reconsider his support for the case had evolved into barely veiled threats about his own future advancement. Prospects. The breaking point came during a meeting with Admiral Sterling and 2 other flag officers at Naval Headquarters in Washington. Admiral Matthews had been summoned under the pretense of discussing fleet readiness assessments, but it became clear within minutes that the true purpose was to pressure him into withdrawing support for Sarah's case. Harrison, this situation has gotten out of hand, Admiral Sterling began, his tone more serious than Matthews had ever heard it. The Webb family is calling in favors from every corner of Washington, and this case is starting to affect the Navy morale and readiness assessments. Admiral Charles Morrison, a 3-star with significant political connections, leaned forward in his chair. We've received informal inquiries from several congressional offices about the handling of this case. There are concerns that pursuing charges against an officer from such a distinguished military family sends the wrong message about how we treat our own people. The 3rd officer present, Admiral Patricia Hendricks, had remained silent throughout most of the meeting, but now she spoke with the authority of someone who had navigated naval politics for 3 decades. Harrison, I understand your loyalty to Lieutenant Chun, and I admire your commitment to justice. But you need to consider the broader implications of this case. Is one officer's personal vendetta worth potentially damaging relationships that have taken years to build? Admiral Matthews felt his temper rising at the characterization of Sarah's assault case as a personal vendetta, but he forced himself to remain calm and professional. Admirals, with respect, we're not talking about personal vendettas or political considerations. We're talking about a violent crime committed by one of our officers against another. If we don't hold people accountable for their actions, regardless of their family connections, what kind of organization are we? Admiral Sterling's expression hardened. Harrison, I've known you for 20 years, and I've never questioned your judgment before. But I'm beginning to wonder if your personal feelings for Lieutenant Chun are clouding your professional perspective on this matter. The suggestion that his support for Sarah was based on personal rather than professional considerations struck Admiral Matthews as particularly unfair. Throughout his career, he had maintained strict boundaries between his personal relationships and his professional responsibilities, and the implication that he was somehow compromised in this case was both insulting and inaccurate. My personal feelings have nothing to do with this decision, he replied firmly. Lieutenant Chun is an exceptional officer who was brutally assaulted by someone she trusted. She deserves the same protection and support that we would provide to any service member in similar circumstances. Admiral Hendricks pulled out a folder and placed it on the table between them. Harrison, we've been reviewing Lieutenant Chun's service record, and there are some concerns about her stability and judgment that might be relevant to this case. Admiral Matthews felt a chill run down his spine. He had been expecting character assassination attempts against Sarah, but he hadn't anticipated that they would come from within the naval leadership structure itself. What kind of concerns? He asked, though he dreaded the answer. Her psychological evaluation from last year noted some issues with authority and interpersonal relationships, Morrison explained. There's also a documented incident where she had a confrontation with a superior officer over a training exercise. The report suggests she may have difficulty accepting criticism and maintaining appropriate professional boundaries. Admiral Matthews was familiar with both the psychological evaluation and the training incident Morrison referenced. The evaluation had noted Sarah's strong personality and occasional impatience with inefficiency, traits that were common among high-achieving officers. The confrontation with her superior had occurred when Sarah questioned a training protocol that she believed was dangerous and outdated a position. That was later validated when the protocol was changed following her recommendations. Those evaluations and incidents have been taken completely out of context, he said. Lieutenant Shen's psychological profile shows exactly the kind of strong leadership qualities we want in our officers, and her willingness to challenge unsafe practices demonstrates exactly the kind of moral courage that makes the Navy stronger. Admiral Sterling leaned back in his chair, his expression suggesting that he had expected this response. Harrison, I want you to consider something carefully. Marcus Webb has agreed to accept administrative punishment and a transfer to a non-operational position. He would also agree to seek counseling for anger management and alcohol abuse. In exchange, Lieutenant Chun would agree to drop the criminal charges and accept a transfer to a different command, where she could continue her career without the distraction of this incident. The proposal was exactly what Admiral Matthews had been expecting, a face-saving compromise that would allow Webb to escape serious consequences while effectively ending Sarah's case. The suggestion that Sarah should be the one transferred to avoid distraction was particularly galling, as it implied that she was somehow responsible for the disruption caused by her decision to seek justice. Has this proposal been presented to Lieutenant Chun? He asked. Not yet. We wanted to discuss it with you first, given your influence over her decision-making process. Admiral Matthews stood up from the table, his patience finally exhausted. Admirals, I need to be very clear about something. I don't have influence over Lieutenant Chin's decision-making process, nor would I want to. She is an adult and an officer in the United States Navy, and she has the right to make her own decisions about how to pursue justice for the crimes committed against her. He moved toward the door, then turned back to face the three senior officers. Furthermore, the suggestion that she should be transferred while her attacker remains in place sends exactly the wrong message about how this organization treats victims of violence. If you want to present this proposal to Lieutenant Chun, you can do so through proper legal channels. But I will not be party to pressuring her into accepting a settlement that serves everyone's interests except her own. The drive back to his base gave Admiral Matthews time to process the conversation and consider his options. It was now clear that the pressure to drop Sarah's case was coming from the highest levels of naval leadership, and his continued support for her was putting his own career at risk. The promise of Webb accepting administrative punishment might seem reasonable to outside observers, but Admiral Matthews understood that such punishment would have minimal impact on Webb's long-term career prospects. When he arrived at his office, he found a message asking him to call Sarah immediately. When he reached her, her voice was tight with stress and anger. Sir, I just received a call from Commander Webb's father. He somehow got my personal cell phone number and called to discuss what he characterized as a misunderstanding between his son and me. Admiral Matthews felt his blood pressure spike. Contact between the accused family and the victim was highly inappropriate and potentially illegal, especially when it involved attempts to influence testimony or settlement negotiations. What exactly did he say? He was very polite and respectful, but the message was clear. He said his son had made a mistake and was willing to face appropriate consequences, but he hoped we could resolve this matter in a way that didn't destroy a promising young officer's career. He also mentioned that he understood I was concerned about my own career prospects and that he had friends who might be able to help ensure that this incident didn't negatively affect my advancement opportunities. The offer of career assistance in exchange for dropping charges was exactly the kind of quid pro quo that military justice regulations were designed to prevent. Admiral Matthews knew that this contact would need to be reported immediately and that it actually strengthened Sarah's case by demonstrating the Webb family's willingness to use improper influence. Sarah, did you record this conversation? No, sir, but I took detailed notes immediately afterward. I also have the phone record showing the date and time of the call. Good. I want you to prepare a written statement about this conversation and submit it to Commander Walsh immediately. This contact was completely inappropriate and needs to be documented as part of the case record. Sir, there's something else. Admiral Webb mentioned that he had spoken with you today and that he understood. You were reconsidering your support for pursuing charges. He suggested that perhaps it would be better for everyone if I accepted the settlement offer and moved forward with my career. Admiral Matthews realized that his meeting with Sterling and the others had somehow been communicated to the Webb family, probably within hours of its conclusion. The speed and coordination of these efforts revealed a level of organization and influence that was both impressive and deeply troubling. Sarah, I want you to know that I have not reconsidered my support for your case, nor will I. What Admiral Webb told you about my position is completely false. The pressure to drop this case is intense, but my commitment to seeing justice done remains unchanged. There was a long pause before Sarah responded, and when she did, her voice was thick with emotion. Sir, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. If pursuing this case is going to destroy your career, I need to know. I won't be responsible for ruining the future of someone who has shown me such loyalty and support. The question forced Admiral Matthews to confront the reality of his situation. His continued support for Sarah's case was almost certainly going to result in negative consequences for his own career advancement, and there was a real possibility that senior leadership would find ways to retaliate against him professionally. But as he thought about his 4 decades of service and the principles that had guided his leadership throughout that time, the answer became clear. Sarah, my career has been built on the principle that leaders protect their people and stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. If supporting your pursuit of justice costs me professionally, then that's a price I'm willing to pay. But I won't let anyone intimidate you into accepting a settlement that doesn't serve justice. 6 months after the charges were filed, the court-martial of Commander Marcus Webb finally began. Despite months of political pressure, legal maneuvering, and attempts at plea negotiations, Sarah had steadfastly refused to accept any settlement that didn't include a public acknowledgement of Webb's crimes and meaningful consequences for his actions. Admiral Matthews sat in the gallery of the military courtroom, watching as Sarah took the witness stand for what would be the most difficult testimony of her life. She wore her dress blue uniform with the same precision and pride that had always characterized her military bearing, but he could see the tension in her shoulders and the careful way she composed herself before speaking. The months leading up to the trial had been brutal for both of them. Admiral Matthews had been reassigned to a desk job at the Pentagon, effectively removing him from operational command as punishment for his refusal to pressure Sarah into accepting the plea deal. The transfer had been presented as a promotion, but everyone understood it for what it really was: bureaucratic exile. Sarah had faced her own challenges, including a coordinated campaign to undermine her credibility that included leaked information about her childhood abuse and suggestions that her relationship with Webb had been more complex than she had initially indicated. The stress had taken a visible toll on her, and there were times when Admiral Matthews worried that she might not have the strength to see the case through to its conclusion. But as he watched her respond to questions from the prosecutor, Commander Walsh, he was reminded once again of the extraordinary resilience that had made her such an exceptional officer. Her voice was clear and steady as she described the events leading up to the assault, and her responses to challenging questions demonstrated both honesty and strength. Lieutenant Chun, can you describe for the court the nature of your relationship with Commander Webb in the months before the assault? Commander Walsh asked. We had been dating for approximately 6 months, Sarah replied. Initially, the relationship was positive, but over time Commander Webb became increasingly controlling and possessive. He would question my professional interactions with male colleagues and express jealousy about time I spent on military duties that didn't include him. The defense attorney, a civilian lawyer hired by the Webb family, objected to the characterization of Webb's behavior as controlling. arguing that normal relationship concerns were being portrayed as something more sinister. But the judge overruled the objection and allowed Sarah to continue her testimony. "Can you describe the events of the evening in question?" Walsh continued. Sarah took a deep breath before responding. And Admiral Matthews could see her drawing on every bit of her military training to maintain composure while recounting traumatic memories. "Commander, Webb arrived at my apartment around 2,000 hours without prior notice. He had been drinking and he was agitated about something that had happened at his work that day. He accused me of having an inappropriate relationship with Captain Morrison from my department, which was completely untrue. When I tried to explain that my interactions with Captain Morrison were purely professional, he became enraged." The defense attorney spent nearly 3 hours cross-examining Sarah, attempting to portray the assault as the result of a mutual argument that had escalated beyond either party's intentions. He questioned her about her drinking that evening, her relationship history, and even her childhood experiences with abuse, suggesting that her past trauma had caused her to misinterpret Webb's actions. Admiral Matthews felt his anger building as he watched the defense attorney systematically attempt to destroy Sarah's credibility. But he was proud to see that she remained calm and composed throughout the questioning. Her military training and natural strength served her well in maintaining dignity under attack. The prosecution's case was strengthened by testimony from Sarah's roommate, who described finding her unconscious and severely injured, and by medical evidence that documented the extent of her injuries. Photos of Sarah's bruises and the damage to her apartment painted a clear picture of violence that went far beyond a simple argument, perhaps. Most damaging to Webb's defense was the testimony of 3 other female officers who came forward during the investigation to describe similar patterns of controlling and aggressive behavior from Webb during previous relationships. Despite intense pressure from the Webb family's lawyers to remain silent, these women had chosen to testify about their own experiences with Webb's psychological manipulation and occasional physical violence. When Webb himself took the stand in his own defense, Admiral Matthews was struck by how different he appeared from the confident, ambitious officer he had known by reputation. The months of legal proceedings and public scrutiny had clearly taken their toll, and Webb seemed diminished and uncertain as he attempted to explain his actions. "Commander Webb, can you describe your state of mind on the evening in question?" his defense attorney asked. "I had been under a lot of stress at work, and I had been drinking more than I should have," Webb replied, his voice barely audible. "When I went to Sarah's apartment that night, I was upset and confused about our relationship. I felt like she was pulling away from me, and I was afraid of losing her." "Did you intend to harm Lieutenant Chun?" "No, absolutely not. I loved her, and I would never intentionally hurt her. What happened was a terrible accident that resulted from an argument that got out of control." But under cross-examination by Commander Walsh, Webb's story began to fall apart. His claims that the violence was accidental were contradicted by the medical evidence, which showed injuries consistent with deliberate and sustained abuse. His assertion that he had been too intoxicated to remember details of the assault was undermined by witness testimony that he had been coherent enough to make threatening phone calls to Sarah's colleagues the following day. Most damaging was Webb's inability to explain the pattern of controlling behavior that multiple witnesses had described. When Walsh asked him about his attempts to isolate Sarah from her colleagues and his demands that she account for her time when they weren't together, Webb's responses were evasive and unconvincing. The closing arguments took place on a Friday afternoon, with both sides making their final appeals to the military jury. The defense portrayed Webb as a good officer who had made a terrible mistake under the influence of alcohol and stress, asking for mercy and rehabilitation, rather than the destruction of a promising career. Commander Walsh's closing argument was a powerful indictment of the culture that allowed officers like Webb to abuse their positions and escape consequences for their actions. She reminded the jury that their decision would send a Message about the Navy's commitment to protecting all service members from violence and abuse. This case is not about destroying Commander Webb's career, Walsh told the jury. This case is about whether we, as an institution, will hold our officers accountable when they violate the most basic standards of conduct and harm those who serve alongside them. Lieutenant Chin showed extraordinary courage in coming forward with her story, despite knowing the personal and professional costs she would face. The question now is whether this court will show equal courage in delivering justice. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with their verdict. Admiral Matthews watched Sarah's face as the foreman announced that Commander Webb had been found guilty on all charges, including assault, conduct unbecoming an officer, and violation of the fraternization policies that governed relationships between officers of different ranks. The sentencing phase would take place the following week. But the conviction itself was a significant victory for Sarah and for the principle that no one, regardless of family connections or political influence, was above the law. As the court recessed, Admiral Matthews saw Sarah embrace Commander Walsh and Lieutenant Commander Santos, the victim advocate who had supported her throughout the process. Outside the courthouse, Admiral Matthews approached Sarah as she spoke with reporters about the verdict. Despite the satisfaction of seeing justice served, he could see the exhaustion and emotional toll that the long legal battle had exacted on her. "How are you feeling?" he asked when the reporters had moved away. "Relieved mostly," Sarah replied, "and grateful to you for standing by me when it would have been easier to walk away. You never gave me a reason to walk away. Your courage and integrity throughout this process have been extraordinary." Sarah was quiet for a moment, looking back at the courthouse where her long fight for justice had finally reached its conclusion. "Sir, I need to tell you something. I've been offered a position with the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, working on cases involving assault and misconduct within the military. I'm considering accepting it." The news didn't surprise Admiral Matthews. Sarah's experience as both a victim and a survivor of the military justice process had given her unique insights that would be valuable in helping other service members navigate similar situations. "That sounds like an excellent opportunity for you to make a real difference in other people's lives," he said. "But whatever you decide, I want you to know that I'm proud of the officer and the person you've shown yourself to be." 6 weeks later, Admiral Matthews attended Sarah's promotion ceremony to lieutenant commander, a recognition of her exemplary service that had been delayed but not derailed by the legal proceedings. As he watched her take the oath and receive her new rank insignia, he reflected on the journey they had both traveled over the past year. Webb had been sentenced to 2 years in military prison, dismissal from the Navy, and forfeiture of all pay and allowances. More importantly, his conviction had sent a clear message throughout the naval community that assault and abuse would not be tolerated, regardless of the perpetrator's background or connections. Admiral Matthews had retired from active duty shortly after the trial concluded, choosing to end his career on his own terms rather than accept the continued exile that senior leadership had planned for him. His decision to support Sarah's case had indeed cost him professionally, but he had no regrets about the choice he had made. As the ceremony concluded and the guests moved to the reception, Sarah approached Admiral Matthews with a small gift box. "I wanted to give you something to remember this experience," she said, handing him the box. Inside was a simple brass compass with an inscription that read, "To someone who never lost his way, even when the path was difficult. Thank you for showing me that courage and integrity still matter." Admiral Matthews looked up at the young woman who had taught him as much about leadership and moral courage as he had ever taught her. "Sarah, the privilege has been mine. Watching you fight for justice, despite all the obstacles and opposition, reminded me why I joined the Navy in the first place, to serve alongside people of character who are willing to do the right thing, even when it's hard." As they stood together in the afternoon sunshine, both of them scarred but stronger for the battles they had fought, Admiral Matthews knew that while their official relationship was ending, the bond forged through their shared commitment to justice would endure long after their military careers had concluded.